Okay, go right ahead.
Okay, as a result of the war, there's concern that the Fed could raise interest rates next month. The Fed anticipated inflation to peak this quarter, but as the geopolitical situation develops, it may push up the prices in the spring and could force the Fed to accelerate interest rate increases this summer, increasing the risk for a recession next year. Typically, the Fed is careful when there's geopolitical shocks and avoids taking risks. However, since inflation is already above its 2% target, and the Ukrainian crisis is starting to push prices higher, the Fed could face urgency to continue with the planned rate rises. And then there was like a testimony with Jerome Powell, a Fed chairman, trying to figure out what to do. And then Fed officials were saying that they would rather start raising the rate in March by a 0.25 percentage point. And majority of the Fed officials agree with this. And if inflation keeps increasing, they may consider larger half-point increases this summer. And then the economic disruptions from Russia's invasion of Ukraine could worsen inflation.
Okay, so this is relevant to what we're dealing with in this chapter. So let me have to dance back and forth to do this. Okay. All right, in the chapter that we're looking at this week, chapter 11 in your textbook, I think, we're introducing the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. And in that model, Mankiw makes it very general in the first place. And he says, okay, in the long run, right, we have a long run aggregate supply curve, a downward sloping aggregate demand curve. But in the short run, he makes the super simple and makes the short run aggregate supply curve perfectly horizontal. This is a large exaggeration. But he does this to simplify the analysis in this chapter. Now, when we have a recession, right, aggregate demand falls generally. Generally, recessions are caused by a decrease in aggregate demand. And one response to that is to boost aggregate demand. One way to boost aggregate demand is through increased monetary supply. However, one of the things that's happened in the most recent recession is that that there have been many supply shocks. And so Mankiw models this as a shift up in the short run aggregate supply curve, leading to higher prices and reduced level of output. Actually, Mankiw uses P here, not pi. I prefer to think about it dynamically. Mankiw is walking through it not dynamically in a static fashion. And this is often called stagflation. And what is it meant by stagflation is that you have both inflation and reduced unemployment at the same time, which to economists working in the 70s seemed to be a huge anomaly. They thought that if inflation went up, unemployment would go down. But in the 70s, both inflation and unemployment went up at the same time. And many people point to the OPEC oil crisis as being the shock that caused that to happen. So during the recession or during the pandemic, you had a reduction in output, but so that's a shift in aggregate supply, but that's been accompanied by a shift also in perhaps quantity demanded in aggregate demand. Although I'm not fully satisfied with this presentation of the model. So there's pressure for the Fed to raise interest rates to try to address inflation and pull inflation down. And then that the mechanics of that we'll get to in the next few weeks. But the question is this, all right, so the Ukraine situation might be more like the oil crisis in the 1970s. The pandemic is its own thing. There's a joke that says the Federal Reserve is always responding to the last crisis. Right? They always address the newest crisis, assuming that the problems are the same as the last crisis. They respond in a way that seems to be the best response to the last crisis rather than the current crisis. But the puzzle is how important is and relevant is the Ukraine situation to the way that the Fed responds. Maybe it'll give the Fed an opportunity to get away with something, to do something that it otherwise couldn't have done or would not have been politically feasible, given that there's also this Ukrainian crisis. Question.
It's like kind of related to this. Do you think that like these geopolitical conflicts that like cause disruption in gas prices shift the demand and supply for like alternative energy sources and cars that run on like energy rather than electric energy rather than gasoline?
I think that they could, but that has to do with the elasticity of demand for fuel, and that the longer a crisis stays in place, the more likely it is that people will substitute away from the use of gasoline. Gasoline was the main example I used for that in the first place, where people buy freezers, right, in the long run. So there's a lot of things tied up in that, right? Okay, what will be the change in access to fuel in the United States? One of the things that's happening with fuel in the United States, I was reading earlier today, is this, right? We can get almost all the fuel we need from a combination of America, Mexico, and the Gulf of Mexico. And so here's America. That's Florida, right? And here's Mexico, and here's Canada. Okay. Now, there's a lot of oil being produced in the Gulf of Mexico. And and that oil could be shipped around to the East Coast or through Panama to the West Coast. But to ship within the United States means that you have to comply with something called the Jones Act. And Jones Act basically says if you're going to transport within the United States, you have to use an American-made vessel, and there are extreme limitations on the size of the vessel that you can use. It's a stupid law. And it was mostly put in place having to do with Puerto Rico for some reason. Okay. So transporting fuel from the Gulf of Mexico to the East Coast would require using inefficient sized tankers, similar to shipping fuel to the West Coast, because of this Jones Act. And so we can't move oil that is being produced in United States territorial waters to the East Coast cheaply enough to make it competitive with oil being shipped across the Atlantic from Russia, or in other ways being shipped from Russia, also probably in China to the United States on the West Coast. And so we import a lot of oil, in part because of this rule that's protecting probably a few concentrated special interest groups. And we all lose as a result. Fun times, right? Okay. If something looks like it's not making sense, right, on the face of it, there's probably a law that's causing it to happen. This goes back to something I may have referred to in the past called Hasnas law. Coined by George Hasnas, who teaches at Georgetown Law. And he says basically, if you want to understand how markets work, look at legislation. Because you're only going to have legislation over a marketplace if the outcome is not what the legislator wants. Otherwise, the legislator would leave it alone. So legislation typically intervenes in markets to accomplish some outcome different from what markets would already work at. So sort of the photo negative of the way that markets work is revealed by looking at legislation. Did I offer too long of an answer to that question? It was the perfect length. Thank you. Is there another news story?
Yeah, I had Fridays that was going today.
Okay, let's do that real quick. Let's not look at my PowerPoint. You know, they put these, you can't see them, but there's like these toolbars on here that are super annoying. All in my page, all in my grill. Okay, who are you? Noah?
Yep.
What do we have here? I can move this thing over here. Here, Biden says.
Okay, so basically, President Biden wants White House policy to stop inflation because, the alternative is the Federal Reserve stopping inflation. And as we've talked about earlier in the semester, that's not normally pretty good for the incumbent. And, the problem is the elections in November are a further issue for Biden, because if the Fed's response to inflation coincides with that time period, it is a like further issue for the Democratic Party. And then also with the Ukraine issue, consumer confidence over natural resources prices is tanking, but the Ukraine crisis could also cause the Federal Reserve to have some pause in responding quickly. So it could, there's kind of two sides to that with the Ukraine crisis.
So what is the relationship between the president and the inflation rate? How does that work mechanically? What does the president got to do with the inflation rate? Supposedly inflation, right, the quantity supply of money is determined by who? The Federal Reserve, right? Okay, what role does the president play in determining the behavior of the Federal Reserve?
Doesn't he appoint him?
He can appoint or reappoint, right, the Federal Reserve chairs and the governors, okay? But once they're there, he can't make them quit. He can pressure them to resign, but he can't make them quit. Okay, so can the president tell the Fed what to do? Well, on paper, no, right? On paper, no. When we read Money and the Rule of Law next semester, or not semester, after break, and you should get a hold of that and start reading it during break or shortly after break. It's a short book, but it's dense, okay? So you should start reading that as soon as you can. We'll see that presidents and Congress have intervened in the activities of the Fed over and over and over again, and most of the time, folks at the Fed cave and do what politicians want them to do. So, now there's also discussions, and I think I shared something from John Cochran about how fiscal policy does influence aggregate demand and monetary policy and inflation. Now, fiscal policy is also supposed to be outside the scope of the president. Fiscal policy has to do with government spending. Right? Which branch of government is responsible for government spending? The House, generally. Right? The House is generally responsible for it, although the president always proposes a budget, and the Senate always has a say, but it's the House's overall role to determine what happens. By the way, that being the responsibility of the House, having the power of the purse, as it's called, is an institutional structure that was inherited from Great Britain, where after the Glorious Revolution, the Parliament of Great Britain imposed great restrictions on what the king could do. You have to understand that it had been the role of the nobility to pay for the king's wars in the past. But that as the monarchy became more ambitious in what it wanted to do, it started taxing more and more people, and Parliament became more than just a House of Lords, but also the House of Commons, such that everyday yeomen could have more of an influence over what it was the government was spending money on. The Lords got freed back with the Magna Carta. You guys remember the Magna Carta? Was it 1216? That's probably not right. It's close. Right? The Magna Carta was signed, why? Anybody ever hear the story of Robin Hood? Right? Robin Hood was involved during the time period of Prince John. Prince John was raising prices of taxes while his brother was off fighting a war in the Holy Land. And the nobility was like, we're not paying for this anymore. Cut it out. And so they signed this Magna Carta basically limiting how much the king could tax, how much the monarchy could tax the people. The people being, of course, the nobility at the time. It became more prescient for commoners later on, and so they decided that they would only allow the king to spend based upon what the House of Commons approved of. And so the power of the purse moved to the House of Commons eventually, which is why it is within the realm of decision-making of the House of Representatives in the United States today. All this matters. Why? Because it's institutional. And it's a question about how democracy is involved and how democracy functions. And all that matters in relation to freedom of speech and who has speech in what context and who has the right to speak up in different contexts. So come out to the event tonight. Like how I did that there. Full marks. Anybody else have news? There's like another submission here that I think it's that Natasha person who I've never met, but is in my online section. Okay, back to home. What else we have going on this week? You've got your exam and a couple of homework assignments that are due Saturday. The exam is only going to cover up through chapter 9, so when you're studying, don't go any farther than that. However, what am I going to do for the rest of the day today? I'm going to share some thoughts about the economics of ideas or exchanging ideas. And I'm going to share printouts of slides because I can't figure out how to make slides work on this thing. This is a lecture that I give every semester to my intro course, but not all of you had my intro course. And those of you that did, it doesn't hurt to review. I'm going to skip some basic stuff and work through it. Any other questions before I get going on that, though? So we're going to talk about exchanging of ideas, which is sort of meta, isn't it? All exchange at its root is the exchange of ideas. Turning ideas into physical objects or services pushes us into the objective world of scarcity, if nothing else, of time. Taking something that exists outside of physical space and that is able to be shared at no marginal cost, and turning it into a property that implies potential use of force for protection, the exclusion of use by anyone other than those holding that property requires an act of imagination. Of course, not everything imagined is lovely. So if we think back about the term exchange, we remember that that exchange has to do with reconciling different points of view. And instead of just talking about maximization of profits and revenues, we're going to talk about catalactics, the science of exchanges. Thomas Jefferson once said, "He who receives an idea from me receives instruction himself without lessening mine. As he who lights his taper at mine," taper being a candle, "receives light without darkening me." When we get an exchange of an idea, it is the least expensive kind of an exchange. As a matter of fact, it's free. When both of us have candles lit, we have more than twice as much light. In a voluntary exchange, both parties are made better off in their own estimation. Those gains from trade are called by economists surpluses. You'll remember how surpluses work. However, whenever one business earns greater profits, it must mean that other firms have lower profits, right? Isn't it a zero-sum game? No, it's possible that new ways of producing things are able to do more with less. Usually this requires some ingenuity and some savings. The manifestation of a new idea requires putting it into the new world, which is costly. And some of you will be familiar with the concept of sequestered capital, that saving up money and investing money in a new idea uses up resources that could be used elsewhere. Once an idea is out in the world is enriched. That enrichment that the development of the new idea creates goes only in part to the person who had the new idea, to the person who made it possible by saving and investing it. The vast majority of the enrichment flows to the consumers and the workers whose labor is more greatly augmented by the new idea. On the one side, the producer captures a wee bit of surplus from many, many exchanges, And that must be shared with employees and owners of inputs, but the buyers each capture a bit of surplus as well, and often a greater share per exchange than the seller. It's more likely that the grocer sells the apple for 85 cents than 95 cents, because it has to compete with other grocers. The entrepreneur with the new idea will face more competition, pushing prices down until almost all the surplus is captured by consumers. In the long run, in most markets, almost all surplus is captured by consumers. You're made better off every year not by an increase in wages that makes it possible for you to buy a larger share of a limited amount of goods, but by an increase in total productivity. And that means there are more and more goods to be purchased. The market process allocates benefits to individuals through making consumption less expensive, more so than it makes income greater through an increase in wages, through improvements in ideas that make us each earn more as well. But there's the problem. If it's costly to develop a new idea, and the profit an entrepreneur might earn from bringing the idea into the world is less than the cost of development, then that new idea won't ever escape that person's mind. It will never see the light of day. It will never generate light that can be shared, and other ideas that might have been kindled by this idea will never spark. We could wind up with an alternate history in which we are all still living in mud huts, those of us who have the opportunity to live at all. All progress, all economic development and growth, every development that makes life today better than yesterday and tomorrow is the result of some innovator bringing some new idea into the world by creativity and savings. No part of economic progress can be attributed to the worker who does not bring forward new ideas. No part of economic progress can be attributed to the landowner who rents out his property. No part of economic progress can be attributed to the owner of capital that is the same as the capital from yesterday. Only new ideas generate economic growth. So how are we going to reward the person who brings our idea into the world? Should we tax away the profits earned from her new innovation? Should we take away her idea and give it to everybody else for free? An idea is an example of a public good. Most of the time we talk about private goods, goods that are both excludable and rival. You may have studied common pool goods a bit. When there's a good that is difficult to keep others from sharing, we might try to put in place some sort of a barrier to turn that good into a semi-private good, like a club good. But some goods are public goods. If an idea is a public good, then once it's in the world, everyone can use it. But that reduces the incentive to share those ideas. So this is why we allow for patents. A patent provides the entrepreneur who brings the idea into the world some protection from competition in implementing that idea for a given period of time. A patent doesn't guarantee profits. A patent doesn't work magic. If the idea is not desired by consumers, it finds no market, and its implementation earns nothing to repay the investment. A patent merely says to anyone else who sees your implementation of the idea, you can't sell that or make money off that idea without permission from the patent holder, the owner of the idea. But there's still an exchange. In exchange for the protected privilege of exclusive implementation for revenue of that idea for a limited period of time, the patent holder must share the entire idea. They have to provide the entire blueprints. Every detail about a patent has to be fully described. Any part that is not fully described is not protected by the patent, and somebody else could do it. In this way, other developers can learn what has been done and seek out ways to build on top of the new idea, and that allows innovation to proceed. Every person in business has an incentive to innovate if it will capture them more business. A couple of years ago, McDonald's started putting bacon on more of its products. This competition might put pressure on some of its competitors, but it benefits consumers, particularly if you like bacon. Bacon. What has happened since the dawn of the 19th century, society has said to innovators, here, we're going to let you have a go at innovating something new. And if successful, we'll let you keep the profits. We'll even let you have some rents in the short run. But in the long run, we're going to let your competitors imitate your innovation. You're going to get less profits, but all the rest of us will share in the surpluses. So that's what Dewey McCloskey calls the bourgeois deal. And by it, she has estimated that the quality of life for people in developed economies currently is 30 to 100 times greater than that enjoyed by almost everyone who lived before the year 1800. The quality of life is somewhere between 30 and 100 times greater than that of people 200 years ago. This development of ideas has also enabled the vast majority of humans to escape mere subsistence living, with much of the gains coming in the last 20 or 30 years. Here's a picture of the world population living in poverty. It's massively declined. You can't really see it. Bring it a little closer. There. Okay, the deal is like this. In the short run, the innovator has a monopoly on her idea. If there are no patents, then as soon as a competitor figures out the innovator's idea, then there's competition, not monopoly. Prices fall, surpluses go to the consumers. This could be recorded actually as a decline in GDP, by the way. If prices fall dramatically, then it will look like GDP has gone down rather than up. So we have to be careful reading GDP numbers. If a patent is granted to the innovator, then the monopoly or implementation of the idea lasts longer, to about 20 years in the US. Now that's relatively short compared to the time frame of human history. But as the rate of innovation increases, 20 years is starting to feel like a long time to some. We also protect other kinds of ideas. We protect brand names that producers develop to communicate information about the reputation of their products, called trademarks. Quaker Oats was one of the first trademark products. It's interesting because you used to go to a grocery and buy oats, and there'd be a big barrel of oats, and you'd stick a scoop in and shovel out some oats, and that was your oats. You didn't know where the oats came from. You didn't know whether there was any quality guarantee on those oats. Quaker Oats started picking its better oats, putting it in canisters, and trademarking it, saying, Quaker Oats. They charged a higher price, but you're more sure about the quality of what you got. We also have protections for creative works called copyrights. Okay. The current copyright laws are often called the mouse laws because they keep on extending the term of the copyright such that Mickey Mouse remains under copyright. Disney has a large role in that. Seems like their gaming system, they are. If an innovator chooses not to patent their idea, they can try to just keep it a secret. If someone else copies the idea, the innovator is not allowed to complain. There's also the problem of plagiarism. So then the innovator always has a dilemma in front of them. What ideas are worth protecting? This problem is as old as the problem of property. A property in something is the right to exclude others from using it. It's a different way of thinking about property. Did I tell you guys a story about the professor and the congressman? Was that in this class? No? One of my professors was driving through Washington, D.C. in a car with a congressman. The congressman points at the Washington Monument and says, "Look at that monument, Professor. Isn't that amazing? That belongs to the American people. That belongs to you." The professor turned to the congressman and said, "Can I sell my part then?" Having a property in something means that it's alienable. It means you can sell it. You can sell it. So then, do you own a property in yourself? Protecting a right can be costly. The music industry discovered this when the marginal cost of copying and sharing a music file fell to almost nothing in the late 1990s with the rise of Napster. Any of you know about Napster? Any of you have any experience using Napster? I doubt it, right? You can't really imagine it because you have Spotify, but Napster was revolutionary because you could take your CD and rip it into an MP3 and put it on your computer. And then you could tell Napster, "Hey, I've got this album on my computer." And then you would give Napster permission to have somebody else copy that file from your computer. And it was just considered sharing. You know, you're not illegally selling anything, you're just sharing it. So you share, your album with everybody else. And so everybody got all the albums that they wanted, and it practically destroyed the record industry. Right? Now, the record industry found new ways of making money, and so we wound up with Spotify, which is pretty good. I mean, it's actually quite incredible. And back in the 80s, if you wanted to get a song or an album that you didn't have the money to buy, you would sit next to your boombox at home, listening to the radio, waiting for the song that you like to turn on, and then you hit the play and record buttons at the same time and record. You're laughing. Do you know how many hours I spent sitting next to my radio?
No.
Screw you. A lot of time doing that. It was hard work. All right. The best you can understand about this is the mixtape, which most of you probably don't own. So what ideas do innovators patent? What do they bother patenting? Easy to copy ideas. If an idea is difficult to copy, trade secrecy is sufficient to protect the idea. So mechanical processes are easy to copy. Drug formulas are easy to copy. Computer code is easy to copy, so it's attractive to patent those things. Once we've decided what areas to protect as property, we have to decide how long we're going to allow them to be protected as property. And here we have a real problem, because the one-size-fits-all solution is clunky and imperfect, which is to say that almost no general length of time will be appropriate for any particular idea. Ideally, the protection will be long enough for the innovator to recover the fixed costs involved in bringing that idea into the world. And so here you can't really see it, but there's all different kinds of time periods that are being discussed for how long a patent should last. I was working with a guy at SAS who was interested in the problem of patent terms. He was suggesting a shorter term on patents or a higher application fee for patents because there were too many patents, way too many patents. Not every idea is valuable. After Blurred Lines, Robin Thicke's album Paula was a flop. Not every idea finds a market. Not every invention works. So a monopoly on a good idea might last long enough to cover for all the flops or bad ideas. So you might want to have enough money to cover all of your ideas, not just the ones that are successful. Most ideas are not good enough for other people to be interested. And many times, the person who is good at coming up with ideas is not good at bringing them out into the world. Different people have different comparative advantages. The owner of an idea has to decide whether to try to bring it out into the world herself or to authorize other people to bring out the idea for them and to share some of the risk captured, for as long as the idea is protected. In patents, this means licensing the use of your idea, where other people pay you to use it. Again, the payment for developing an idea will have to be greater than, so the payment has to be greater than the cost of developing that idea, the cost of all the other ideas that failed, right? The cost of the opportunity, cost of your use of time, right? And then the cost to defend the idea, right? You have to pay the opportunity cost, otherwise the innovator will go find something else to do. And you have to pay to defend that patent and to pursue those who try to steal your idea. So the rate at which we allow a patent to earn profits has to cover all of these costs, which is why patented things might be very expensive. And actually in my last section, students were talking about EpiPens, right? Or insulin is another example where the price got really, really high. So then we tend to see patents really only paying off for big ideas. Ideas that bring about very large shifts in the marketplace. Lots of ideas instead are simply brought immediately into the world without seeking protection. In the short run, competitive profits from any successes quickly whittle away as rivals imitate successes. So most patented ideas are big picture ideas because the cost of patenting small ideas might be prohibitively high. In some cases, the cost of defending an idea becomes so great that the entire industry shifts to less protection. So we get something like open source software. Now, suppose we come up with an idea and we try to patent it. We then choose to license that patent to people who want to implement it into their products. What price should we charge for access to our technology? We go back to the problem of identifying a right price between the willingness to sell and the willingness to pay. Any price in that range will consummate the exchange. There's a problem that could arise. The average smartphone reads on hundreds of thousands of patents. Some of those patents are owned by rival phone makers, and some are owned by firms that never made phones, or used to but don't anymore. Who gets what share of the revenue from selling another phone? Phone makers all want to cooperate so that if I have a Samsung and you have a Huawei, we can still talk to each other. So many of the patents, especially those for software that encodes and decodes voice signals, must be implemented in every phone. That's called a network effect. Network effect means that the value of a product or service increases according to the number of others using it. This is the reason why cell phone patent wars have been so complicated. But I want to remind you of something. These patent wars have been all battles over surpluses. And as I mentioned to other classes, a lot of that's just squabbling over surpluses. We want those surpluses, as much as is possible, to accrue to consumers. But we want them to exist at all, primarily, as an incentive for innovation. Because in the long run, we, the consumers, get the majority of the surplus. The patent wars are squabble over surpluses. There is no right distribution of surpluses. We are benefited from living with other people due to opportunities to specialize according to our comparative advantages, to produce more of some good or service than we individually need, and then to exchange some of that good or service for other things we want with others. This process encourages peace, growth, and flourishing. Final word about these images, right? That we're using here. A lot of them are copyrighted. A lot of these images are copyrighted. So this video will probably be taken down from YouTube. But I claim that I'm making fair use of it. I'm using it to describe something. Now maybe this one I'm not making as good a fair use of because it's just put on there for kicks. Right? And Warner Brothers, I'm pretty sure would not want me to use that. If I make use of an idea, it's obvious that I'm not claiming to have originated that idea, then I'm permitted to make fair use of it. That's all, folks. So when we think about the solo model and other models for economic growth, this type of technological growth and advancement is what we're really interested in. In understanding how that process works helps us to understand a little bit better about what opportunities for growth do exist, but also how tenuous they are, how easily they can be threatened. Okay, any questions about all of that? Any interesting thoughts? What I want to do when we come back from break is I'll go into, there's a list of economic indicators. And what I'll do is I'll go through that list of economic indicators provided in the textbook and think of some others that maybe are interesting. And I'll show you the graphs for each of those up to the current day. So we'll look through that next time. But for right now, I want to do one little thing having to do with this aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. And I want to ask, what does aggregate demand mean? You have a demand for a good or a service. We have our old supply and demand graphs. What is your demand for a certain good or service? It's assuming that the price is a stand-in for all other goods and services. You demand this much of a good or a service, you demand this much of butter, right? Because the price indicates what you have to give up in terms of everything else. However, the aggregate demand curve, the price on this axis can't represent the opportunity cost of other goods or services because I've already got all goods and services included. So the price isn't talking about the opportunity cost of buying everything as compared to buying nothing. The trade-off here has to do with the price level. How much of everything can I have? There's a little girl who went and saw Santa Claus, Christmas time. Santa Claus said, "What do you want for Christmas, little girl?" And she said, "I want all of the toys." And of course you do. Everybody does. But you can't have it all. Right? I once watched a Lifetime movie about a young woman who left her loser boyfriend. I was watching it backwards. This young woman who left her loser boyfriend in a small town, moved back to the big city, got a great job, and wore a pencil skirt every day, had a happy life. That's what happens when you watch a Lifetime movie backwards. You guys haven't had to do it many of those. But I've been married for 23 years. I also can almost verbatim, line by line, go through the BBC version of Pride and Prejudice. So then the aggregate demand curve is not about the trade-off between this particular good and everything else. It's all the goods are already in here, so it's about the price level. What affects the price level? Well, the quantity of money and the velocity of money affect the price level. If there's more money and velocity is constant, the price level goes up. If there's a constant level of money and the velocity of money goes up, there's more money flowing. The price of everything goes up. So in this static version, right, this aggregate demand curve is the schedule of differences between the price level and output for any given combination of quantity of money and velocity. So then these two variables are endogenous to our model. These two variables are exogenous to the model. If there's a change in the price level, everything else held constant, we move along our aggregate demand curve. However, if either the quantity of money or the velocity of money changes, we shift the whole aggregate demand curve. So changes in the shifts along of the aggregate demand curve originate either in a change in the quantity of money or the velocity of money. We're going to, as we build this model, we're going to take money and basically say that's the role of the Fed. Right? Velocity, we're going to include in velocity y equals c plus I plus g plus mx. All right, we're going to say that velocity is related to the fiscal side of things. Right, that's how we're going to break down our analysis of this stuff. Changes in consumption will affect velocity, will then affect aggregate demand. Changes in investment will affect velocity, will then affect a shift in aggregate demand. So on and so forth. Okay. So that's how we're building this model as we go through it. What can we say about the aggregate supply curve? The long-run aggregate supply curve is the maximum sustainable level of output at any given time in the economy. It's real. It's what we can actually do, what we can actually make. It has nothing to do with monetary policy. It's what's actually plausibly achievable given the current level of technology, capital, labor, etc. in the economy. It's what we can actually make. It is our production possibility frontier. It's not sensitive to changes in the price level. That's why it's perfectly inelastic. This is how much we can make no matter what price level we're at. No matter how the price level adjusts. We can make this much stuff given how much capital and other inputs we have available to us. We can do this. In the short run, fluctuations in the price level might move us to the left or the right of our long-run aggregate supply curve, but this is home. This is where we always come back to. This is what we could actually sustain in the long run. I think it would be a useful exercise to think about how we move or show the interrelationship between the production possibility frontier, the business cycle graph, quality of life, and the solo growth model. How are each of these related to this? Be a good idea to write out in prose an explanation of how all these things are interrelated to one another. After the break. Not before the exam, but before the final. All right, what else is there? Oh, there's a short run aggregate supply curve. And in this chapter, Matthew presumes it's perfectly horizontal, and the reason for that is he wants you to understand the role of sticky prices. The prices are sticky, in particular, from going down. Prices are more likely to go up than they are to go down. In the real world, the short and average supply curve looks more like this. Relatively elastic to the left of the long run aggregate supply curve, relatively inelastic to the right of the long run aggregate supply curve. When we're in a recession, people are less willing to have their wages go down. When we're in an expansionary period, people are quite happy to take higher wages. Okay. Short run aggregate supply has to do with our expectations about inflation. What do we expect to happen with inflation? Do we expect inflation is low or high? And I'll stop there.